War. War never changes. Since the dawn of humankind, when our ancestors first discovered the killing power of rock and bone, blood has been spilled in the name of everything from God to justice to simple psychotic rage.
Thank you for chipping in to the next installment of Cyberpunk 2077 lore, this time focusing on the military and American conflicts leading up to Cyberpunk Red. In 1989, the Berlin Wall was declared non-operational. With its death, the Cold War between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States of America and its allies also died. The arms race which the Cold War inspired had taken the lion's share of the world's economy for over 40 years. Culminating in gigantic standing armies, runaway peacetime weapons development, nuclear arsenals capable of devastating the planet several times over, and massive military-industrial complexes devoted to prospering from the arms race. With the cessation of the Cold War, the need for these unbelievable militaries also ceased. The United States had maintained its armed forces at a wartime level since the end of the World War II, a fantastic record for a nation known for maintaining a peacetime army barely large enough for a cadre in the event of a real war. While this expenditure had assisted the nation's economy by providing jobs and industries, the multi-billion-dollar cost of the military did more economic harm than good, contributing to the nation's seemingly impossible international debt. As early as 1990, there were cries for a peace dividend in the US, a build-down of military power, and a return of government monies to domestic programs. This movement gained strength after the Pyrrhic success of military intervention in Iraq in 1991. The US military, with assistance from allied nations, scored an embarrassingly easy victory over the forces of Saddam Hussein, devastating his numerically impressive army. As usual though, the success was not properly pursued. As soon as the battle was won, the US government ordered a ceasefire and ended the war without achieving the goal of removing Hussein as a threat to the region. Indeed, the only thing that the short and expensive war seemed to prove was that the US had the forces of a major world power, but not the will to use them to the country's advantage. In the early 1990s, the peace dividend was finally realized, and the US military was reduced accordingly, disposing of the large units they used to dominate the battlefields of the world and opting for a set of small, fast, rapid deployment units that could act independently. These units were to incorporate their own organic support and, wherever possible, transport. In 1991, the US anti-drug bioagent took effect all over the world. Hardest hit were the drug lords of South America, the main suppliers to the US market. Their power waned with the destruction of their narcotic-producing plants. They used their connections with the large EEC corporations to strike back, attacking the DEA on all fronts. Whether the Eurocorps were doing business with the drug lords or were simply taking advantage of an opportunity to weaken American resources, the result was the same. Conflict had already begun a year earlier with a limited intervention in the Canal Zone. The DEA, caught up in the Gang of Four's political paranoia, expanded the war by sending the National Armed Forces further south. The gang was formed by the NSA, CIA, FBI, and DEA. For those unfamiliar with these acronyms or organizations, the CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, is the civilian foreign intelligence service of the federal government of the USA, tasked with gathering, processing, and analyzing national security information from around the world. The NSA, or National Security Agency, is an intelligence agency of the United States Department of Defense. The FBI, or Federal Bureau of Investigation, is the domestic intelligence and security service of the US and its principal federal law enforcement agency. Finally, there is the DEA, or Drug Enforcement Administration, a federal law enforcement agency under the United States Department of Justice, tasked with combating drug smuggling and distribution. The result was predictable. In the nearly 30 years since the Vietnam conflict, the lessons hard learned in the swamps of Southeast Asia had been forgotten. As before, large units equipped with heavy machinery were sent into the combat theater, where they unsuccessfully tried to chase down guerrilla units. The pattern started all over again. The enemy would strike and melt away into the tropical forests, sometimes even disappearing into the local populace. Partisan activity took a heavy toll on US forces as acts of sabotage became the norm. Propaganda campaigns and assistance programs were useless. Local economies had practically run on the wealth brought in by the drugs if you weren't directly employed in producing drugs. Then you got your money from someone who was. This was the economic bond that had brought the drug lords to power in the first place. So much power that the actual governments of their countries were practically powerless to move against them. The people of the Southern Americas were quite aware of the fact that the Americans had deprived them of their livelihood and hated them for it. They were only too glad to strike back in any way that they could. The new organizational plans proposed to supply the peace dividend were supplemented and altered by developments in South America, as the war in Vietnam had created the air-mobile concept. The first Central American conflict molded the air-mobile unit into a total aerodyne transport and combat outfit. Tactical experience proved that even helicopters couldn't deal with the thick forests in the face of interlocking anti-aircraft fire. Only aerodynes had the speed and aerial dexterity to accomplish this. Almost every aerodyne flying in 2020 traces its origins back to the AVX-2, the first viable combat aerodyne. The US military was becoming increasingly air-mobile and seemed destined to develop the world's first entirely aircraft-based army, which, when combined with new long-range smart weapons and 24-hour continuous battle tactics, began reversing the heavy casualty ratio back in favor of American forces. Then the bottom fell out. The stock market crash of 94 snowballed into the collapse of 95, and the Gang of Four began recalling ground units to the US, fearful of what might happen. Their concern was justified when federal authority collapsed altogether in 1996, and anarchy began. On August 17th, both the president and vice president were killed during separate campaign stops. As the situation grew worse, a joint session of Congress was convened to deal with the issue of who would lead the country. Absurd levels of infighting prevented anyone from forming a coalition. Mr. Seward, the former Secretary of Defense, had little choice. To save what was left in America, he declared martial law. Several members of the Senate attempted to form corporate-backed coalitions. These were beaten down soundly. The diplomatic corps attempted to eliminate the trade embargoes that were crippling America. They would not succeed until late in 1998. The greatest problem, however, the one that proved nearly insurmountable, remained the Gang of Four. Pentagon planners tried to group as many disparate units together as possible, under the precept that every military-controlled district should have the units necessary to handle any situation or emergency. Thus, paratrooper units found themselves sharing bases and duties with armors, special forces, with supply infantry, with air superiority fighters, even marine amphibious forces with army artillery battalions. This hodgepodge ad hoc policy was the direct forerunner of the Combined Operations Group of 2020. The scarcity of supply and fuel brought even more changes to the once air-mobile units. One problem with AVs was that they consumed immense amounts of Chew-2 fuel. Ground vehicles were more economical to operate than aerodynes. Combined with a lack of parts for the relatively new aerodynes, this practically grounded the AV forces. Groups relying on AV transport were hastily converted to tanks, APCs, and in some cases trucks. At least these machines had ample stocks of spare parts and could be maintained and kept running without the need for large-scale new manufacturing. The government hoped that the period of anarchy wouldn't last long enough to exhaust the stockpiles. The period of anarchy was, as had been recorded elsewhere, brutal. It was one of the few good times in American history to be in the military. To maintain order, the military governors had to authorize actions that seemed in retrospect, to be less than humanitarian in the very least. The Houston incident, perpetrated by troops under the command of Brevet General Daryl Pfister, involved the killing of over 2,000 civilians via concentrated artillery barrage when they refused to turn back from entering Houston as per martial law orders. The mass hangings at Kansas City, as per Lieutenant General Marty Norman's dictates. The shoot on-site curfew in New York and other East Coast cities where anyone seen after curfew would be shot by roving patrols. General Boyle Lodge saw it as a way of curbing violence after dark. Incidents such as these, combined with the general attitude of the soldiery and the fact that the populace perceived them as dictatorial thugs living high on tyranny, fed, armed and maintained for the purpose of killing civilians, bred a negative image of the military that has remained to this day. Most of the military actions of the martial law period occurred when federal forces clashed with state militias and National Guard troops. By and large, these territorial troops had remained loyal to their respective state governments and had forsaken federal service, acting in unison with federal forces only when their purposes met the agendas of the state rulers. For the most part, these actions were small, involving units of squad size, more turf fights than military actions. There was one major battle of this sort, the Battle of Edwards, where Governor E. Brown got greedy and sent Californian forces to capture Edwards Air Force Base and its crop of fledgling space planes. With help from rival Nevadan troops, the defenders of Edwards repelled the Californian assault. As federal planners had hoped, the period of martial law violence did not last long. The major acts of mass violence took place within the first 2 years of martial law declaration. Between violence, economic upheaval, starvation, and disease, the population of the US was reduced to a number where the capability for mass mob violence was significantly reduced. The loss of food sources and the drought of '98 accelerated this trend, and the wasting plague of 2000 ensured government-controlled medical care was provided only to those who could come into control areas and submit to martial law. A great many dissidents died of the plague. When martial law was revoked and regional committees took over government of the former martial law regions, the military retained a strong presence in the governmental process. Each regional committee has a military liaison, a representative from the military's governor's office. These liaisons ensure that military priorities are represented, as well as improving cooperation between military forces and civilian authorities. Even though the US military is still viewed in a poor light by the populace, this cooperation is necessary for the security of the nation and the regional areas, because the US military represents the only armed force capable of keeping independent corporations in line. During this time period, General William Nowell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, decided that the best way to deal with the NSA was to wait for the enemy to make a mistake. Unfortunately, waiting cost him dearly. The NSA initiated hostilities with 5 countries, forcing the general into the Second Central American War. The army that Seward had freed up was sent to another dirty war, and the NSA retained its position of dominance. The so-called drug war had really been over for years, almost since the bioplague had destroyed the cocoa and opium in the 90s. The American agricultural base had been destroyed by the mounting problems of the environment. Acid rain, drought, and toxic waste had made the previously profitable fruit-growing areas of California, Texas, and Florida economic wastelands. The stabilization of these South American countries could provide new areas for cultivation. Since the restructuring of the Soviet Union, hundreds of nuclear weapons had gone on the open market. Many of these weapons had made it to South America. The possibility of a nuclear enemy within the Americas was horrifying to the gang. By testing special operations, new cyber troops, both the nuclear threat and cyber training could be dealt with at once. Over half of the Special Operations Command, aka SOC, was controlled or attached to the CIA. William Newell's connections in the SOC led him to the truth about the Gang of Four. He allowed the SOC full immunity if they would testify, and testify they did, revealing that the NSA had planned and coordinated the apparent accidental deaths of many high-level members of the former United States government, including the death of the president himself. After the testimony of the SOC, the CIA's command structure was co-opted into the plan to eliminate the NSA. With a modicum of civilian control and order returning to the United States, the Department of Defense once again turned their attentions to the Central American problem. They were confident that their new military units equipped with AVs and the beginnings of cyber soldiery could defeat the depleted forces of the South American drug lords. They legitimized the war by declaring that the drug lords were still a danger to the US economy, even though most drugs sold in the US were purely artificial designer narcotics, manufactured domestically. It was universally recognized that the war was nothing less than a nearly naked land grab to supply the US with a captive resource base and a solid hold over the entire Western Hemisphere. This move is also what delayed the final destruction of the Gang of Four. It was resisted by the Euro corporations, which already had a solid economic hold over South America. The war turned into a struggle for domination of the rest of the hemisphere, with the US pouring almost all its military force into it, and the Eurocorps providing aid, training, equipment and money to the indigenous armies resisting the invasion. This pattern mirrored the decades-old Soviet tactic of fighting wars. Let's you and him fight. This was not a coincidence. The Euros chose the military advisors of the neo-Soviet Union to guide the progress of the war. In this case, the European plan was not to directly contest the American military effort, but instead to make the invasion so costly that the Americans would lose in the end, replicating the pattern established in Vietnam and Afghanistan. Obligingly, the Gang of Four decided to invade with full force into the inhospitable territories of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru and Venezuela, fighting in a combination of jungle and mountainous terrain against determined foes, people defending their ancestral homes and lives. Naturally, the American cost in casualties and material loss was tremendous. The war dragged on for almost 8 years, draining the US economy. True to the neo-Soviet plan, the war was terminated not by military loss, but by the lack of military victory. The Gang of Four, struggling to maintain popularity with and power over the American people, had settled on a successful war as the best and quickest plan to bolster their sagging control. It backfired, and the Gang of Four was swept from office by government reforms passed by the new Congress. It took another 4 years and bloody covert fighting worldwide to eliminate the more powerful elements of the Gang of Four. Huge damage was done to the United States intelligence community, damage that would never be repaired. On November 7th, 2008, the first free elections in America were held. It had taken 12 years, but the transition to the new federal Senate was marred by relatively few acts of violence. The final death rows of the gang took place in metropolitan Washington, bottled up by the military. Their operatives simply could not get out, and their allies could not get in. Many of the states surrounding DC simply blockaded all traffic and let the gang beat itself to death against the military. It now seems strange that an organization like the NSA was destroyed so quickly. The truth is, there was no way to eliminate an organization of such size and power. It was not killed, just made. Those with real power in the gang had sold out to the mega corporations long before the organization was directly attacked, and thus they continued to exert their influence under a new guise. The Central America War continued to drag on at a reduced level, degenerating into a series of small firefights between American troops and indigenous guerrillas. Finally, the US gave up and the war ended with a whimper. The Eurocorps triumphant. As the US forces began to pull out of their bases and return to the States, one of the most tragic events of the war occurred. And during the war, the understaffed military had hired hundreds of thousands of civilian contractors, most of them skilled but unemployed before the conflict began. By the end of the war, over 500,000 of them were on site in Panama City and other military bases in Panama and Colombia. Unfortunately, severe budget cuts by the new Congress curtailed the amount of money available for the withdrawal to the US, and the decision was made to abandon the civilians in Panama, terminating their employment and leaving them high and dry while the rest of their regular military left. The result was the infamous Nomad March of 2010, which had a higher casualty count than the war and culminated in the formation of numerous Mexican nomad gangs and coastal pirates. Military action would not be confined to terrestrial conflicts though. The United States Aerospace Force, aka USAF, totally stripped of its domination of the skies by popular demand, turned to building the most powerful space force in near orbit. This was matched by the Soviet Union's own ESA-assisted space armament plan, and the two powers proceeded to litter near orbit with killer satellites, concealed drones, work habitats and massive battle stations, which served as orbital fortresses and bases. Space patrols periodically cleaned out orbital nests of enemy hardware under the basis of UN space salvage laws of 1995, which dictated that any unidentified object in orbit constituted a danger to orbital navigation and could be removed and salvaged by any responsible party. Since the killsacks, drones and spy eyes were naturally not identified, to do so would negate their concealment and therefore their effectiveness, Soviet and USAF shuttles plied the space lanes, scavenging each other's weapons. The ESA and the High Riders stayed away from the conflict because many of the devices were booby-trapped and highly dangerous to anything approaching too closely. These operations brought inimical hardware into proximity with explosive results. Incidents of damage and injury began to mount, and opposing patrols started exchanging morphing greetings and navigational data when they passed. The crisis mounted until the surprise attack on the Mir 13 space weapons platform, the near Earth's biggest battle station. The USAF successfully boarded it with Marines in the only spacesuit invasion in history. The ESA intervened on the part of their allies, and a short space war raged for about 6 hours until the ESA bombed Colorado Springs from Luna. In the meantime, over 40% of the world's Earth-to-orbit platforms and vehicles had been destroyed by the all-out war. The fledgling Crystal Palace survived only because of its distant orbit and its low target priority. The First Orbit War, as it came to be known, set the record for the highest cost per hour in material destroyed or expended, $2.98 billion per hour. Following the Second Central American War, the US military returned in infamy to fade into the political background of the nation. It continued to exist as a well-equipped defense organization, slowly rebuilding its strength after the South American debacle. Its mission returned to that of a century ago, national defense rather than a tool of international policy. The only military holdings maintained outside the continental USA are the Hawaiian Islands, Panama, and the island of Guam. Hawaii is strongly fortified because it is a state. Panama and Guam are held out of sheer stubbornness and tradition. The USAF has two missions: the maintenance of military strength in orbit and the elimination of ESA power on the moon. Following the First Orbit War, the USAF had been steadily rebuilding its near-orbit strength, with an eye towards the destruction of ESA far-orbit assets. It's common knowledge that one good missile would put paid to the Crystal Palace. As soon as the mass drivers on the moon are neutralized, the ESA is targeted for destruction. Internally, the US military has gained another duty: balance of power. The elected US government saw the military as a tool to keep the powerful corporations that inhabit US soil in line. Collectively, the corporations field twice as many soldiers as the US Army and Marine Corps combined. Individually, though, no corporation, not even security giant Arasaka or mercenary power Militech, can match the firepower of the US Army. The power of the US military machine vis-a-vis corporations was amply demonstrated during what is called the Mantoga Incident, when the Mantoga Corporation was destroyed by military effort. This took place prior to the return of free elections in 2008, during an abortive attempt to relax military government and appoint a president. On November 5th, 2005, presidential appointee Henry Jacobi was assassinated. Evidence strongly pointed to Mantoga Incorporated involvement and instigation, and on November 17th, 2005, the corporation was given 4 hours to completely pull out of the United States of America. This ultimatum was ignored by the corporation to its sorrow. Exactly 4 hours after the issue of the ultimatum, ultimatum, Army forces moved on all Mantoga Incorporated facilities, destroying every Mantoga office with concerted airstrikes, and overrunning all storage and factory facilities with troops, armor, and artillery. The operation took 12 hours, including mopping up. Intelligence operatives and covert military direct action units, for example assassins, followed up, pursuing and killing Mantoga employees and operatives who escaped the country. On April 3rd, 2006, Operation Big Stick was officially closed when the last Mantoga Incorporated administrator was assassinated in Bonn, Germany. This genocidal military action has remained as an example to all corporations on American soil of what happens when the US government is pushed too far. Despite the example of Operation Big Stick and the generally poor reputation of the US military, relations with powerful corporations in the US remain largely cordial. The US military is a big and powerful client with a budget few clients can command, so most corporations attempt to maintain friendly business relations. Chief among these are Arasaka, IBM, Militech, Orbital Air, Petrochem, and WorldSat, all big suppliers of one commodity or another to the US military complex. Militech has particularly strong ties to the US Armed Forces through the influence of former USMC General Lundy, its CEO. This influence extends from participation in secret US military projects to sales to the armed forces, to leasing Militech troops for Army or Marine Corps use when they don't have enough for the job at hand. Aside from the South and Central American wars, the US military would play a defining role in the Fourth Corporate War. On October 12, 2022, President Kress activated the armed forces and authorized the USAF to take any steps necessary to remove the presence of hostile corporate satellites from American skies. The USAF gunship Agamemnon began attacking 4 launchers or ASAT weapons, while her sister Achilles was positioned over Tycho City in case the Europeans tried anything. On the 22nd of October, General Donald Lundy of Militech found himself confronted with a reactivation clause, placing him under the direct command of the President. The President promptly ordered Lundy to stand down his troops and cease all hostile activities at once or be court-martialed and executed. While it is unknown exactly how the Fourth Corporate War will end within the Cyberpunk 2077 timeline, it was initially implied that when withdrawing back to Japan, Arasaka staged a coup to overthrow the government. With nuclear missile supply from ally North Korea, Arasaka held Japan and the rest of the world hostage until the Japanese self-defense fleet finally crushed the Arasaka shogunate. JSDF Admiral Hattori captured Saber Arasaka in his mountain compound. In a televised military trial, he condemned Arasaka and beheads him. Hattori subsequently sent the head back to US President Elizabeth Kress, expressing the profound apologies of the Japanese people. The Fourth Corporate War was finally over, at a cost of millions of lives and immense destruction. The survivors have sworn never to let the megacorps rebuild their private armies again, but without the threat of a powerful national military to hold them in check. It's only going to be a matter of time till the corporate warlords are back to their old tricks. Let us see what happens in Cyberpunk Red. Hey Samurai, I'm Kazuliski and I hope you found this Cyberpunk 2077 lore to be informative. Are you interested in more Cyberpunk 2077 content? Then be sure to hit that subscribe button. If you have any questions or feedback, please let me know in the comment section. Thank you for chipping in.